I made this final video for those of you who are not sure how exactly to go about having the kind of final discussion I suggested you should have. It will be an example of how one can go about exploring the relationship between the contents of the climate module and the contents of a typical intro textbook. Of course, I have no way of knowing what book you have been assigned to read, so I need to pick some reading or other to use for this demonstration. I think it makes sense to use what is now the single best-selling intro textbook in the United States. That would be this textbook, Dalton Conley's You May Ask Yourself. Looking again at my Venn diagram, the circle on the left now has this content: all the chapters in Conley's book. And the circle on the right contains our familiar list of 25 topics that you can see on the website. Now we can begin to populate this diagram with some real content. Actually, before I do that, I want to add one more bit of complexity. Here, I have divided the intersection X into two parts. X part A now stands for any passage in a textbook that explicitly talks about climate. In most of the textbooks that I've looked at, some of the best-selling textbooks in the US, the piece of the diagram that I labeled X part A is pretty small, just a couple of paragraphs. X part B stands for chapters, or parts of chapters in textbooks that are not explicitly about climate, but may in fact be relevant for understanding some aspect of the climate issue. I believe that we will find that most sociology textbooks have quite a bit of content that fits into this category. Let's now go back to Conley and look at his table of contents in light of our diagram. Conley discusses climate explicitly, that is, in our diagram terms, part XA, in chapter 17. Here, Conley's book is actually a lot better than many of the other best-selling textbooks. In those books, climate almost always gets less than a page. In Conley, climate gets almost 3 pages. In those pages, he reviews the physics of climate change, and he goes on to describe some potentially dire impacts: flooded coastal cities, rising health threats, falling food supplies, mass migrations. The content is actually pretty good. The problem, however, is that those 3 pages arrive late in the next to last chapter, not until page 674 of a 737-page book. And that sends a message, whether it means to or not, that the issue is really not all that important. Let's now take a look at the category we have been calling X Part B. That is, those parts of Conley's book that discuss ideas that are relevant to climate, but not explicitly about that. It turns out that here, Conley's book has a lot of relevant content. For example, chapter 14 on capitalism and the economy is quite relevant to thinking about the social causes of climate change. Several chapters turn out to be quite relevant to thinking about impacts. I would include here chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, which all deal with various facets of inequality. I would also include chapter 11, which deals with health, and which could be expanded to encompass the health impacts of climate change. Several other chapters prove to be quite useful potentially for understanding societal responses. Chapter 3 on media, Chapter 15 on government, the part of Chapter 17 that's about the sociology of science, and Chapter 18 on collective action and social movements. Those are all the potential points of intersection between this textbook and the climate issue. So, in this case, Section X, Subpart B, of our Venn diagram turns out to have quite a lot in it. That said, there is inevitably a lot of Conley's book that falls into the left side of our Venn diagram. Modern academic sociology is very broad. It analyzes all the facets of human social life, some of which, although obviously important and interesting, don't have all that much to do with the climate crisis. For the sake of keeping this video as short as possible, I will not say any more about the left side of the Venn diagram. I would like to spend a minute, though, on the right side, the side where we find in Conley almost complete silence. Silence about what are in fact some of the most pressing issues raised by the prospect of climate change. I would characterize that silence as a failure to acknowledge two fundamental facts. First, that human societal well-being is completely, fundamentally, profoundly dependent on a working, successful, sustainable relationship with nature. And second, that beyond some threshold, a serious disturbance in that relationship can trigger societal crisis and even societal collapse. Society's dependence on nature, and the consequences if the interaction between society and nature breaks down. Those are the stark realities that underlie the concerns with climate impacts on food, water, illness and health, nations' economies, and political systems. It is true that some of Conley's text sounds pretty ominous. He mentions that extreme weather can portend drastic consequences for society, and he writes that massive migration could cause a significant refugee crisis. But a few dire words, dropped into a book almost at the very end, falls far short of acknowledging the seriousness, the urgency, the existential threat of climate change in our time. Let me say finally that I went through this exercise with Conley as a demonstration of the kind of discussion your class can have. The content will undoubtedly be different, but the process is likely to look and sound something like this. Thank you.